Hi there. In this second part of the tutorial series on programming from the very basics using Python, we will learn how to get started with a Python environment. So we'll learn what it takes to write Python programs, maybe save it to a file, or evaluate small Python code snippets and see the outcome. In order to work on Python, there are two essential workflows that you should be aware of. One is an interactive REPL. REPL stands for Read, Eval, Print, Loop. It's REPL. So, using a REPL, you can try out small code snippets, which are made up of simple statements or expressions and see the outcome immediately, but you cannot really save them, right, into a file or so on by default. In case you want to save it to a file so that you can execute them later on, you would write it in a program stored in a file. So I will show you how to get started with the REPL first. You can go to if you're using Windows, you can go to the search and search for Anaconda prompt. Just type Anaconda partially and you can see it auto completes. It shows up Anaconda prompt here, or you might see Anaconda Navigator PowerShell prompt. Select Anaconda prompt. And you'll see the Windows terminal opening up with a prompt here. There's a Windows prompt. And remember, at the Windows prompt, you cannot try Python statements or Python code. This prompt is provided so that you can launch the Python REPL. So to launch the Python REPL, or the Python shell for short, you can just type Python right here. When you type Python at this particular shell prompt, what you're greeted with is a Python shell prompt which ends with this triple greater than prompt. It is that at this prompt, you can try small Python code snippets, which will be evaluated, and you can see the outcome of that right in this REPL. For example, if at all I want to try some simple expression, I can do something like say 1 plus 2. This is a simple arithmetic expression. So as I already showed you in the previous session, this is an example to show how you can test your Python code. You can try various expressions, which I will cover in the next session. For now, this is a REPL interface where you can try small Python code snippets. But whatever you do in this REPL is not stored onto a file. It's not stored anywhere. So once you exit it, whatever you type in here is lost. So what is this used for? This is mostly useful for exploration. If at all you want to explore some new features or new idea, where you don't really want to save something, but you want to try out things, you can try this out on a REPL. And this is a good way to learn interesting vocabulary in Python language. If at all you want to save your code into a file for further access and execution, you can use an editor or an IDE. An IDE stands for an integrated development environment, which is nothing but a sophisticated programmer's editor with a lot of tool chains that lets you run programs, right? VSCode, which we installed in the previous session, falls into the category of IDEs. So it's a exotic editor, right, to edit programs. So you can open up VS Code. I think I've linked VS Code on my taskbar, but if you don't have it in your taskbar, you can always search for code here. Just type VS Code itself, should show up on Windows. You can see a VS Code, VisualStudio Code app. You can click on this and this is launched. This is a welcome screen. The first thing you want to do on VS Code is setting up your Python environment. In order to do that, first thing I recommend you do is open a folder. So you can see in the welcome screen, you have an open folder link that shows up here. You can also open a folder by selecting File menu and click on Open Folder right here. When you open folder, it shows up your home directory or home folders here in an Explorer interface. You can select any folder of your choice, but I would recommend you to create a folder for saving all your Python code. So the things are more organized that way. So what I would do is click on this new folder button and you can see a new folder that comes up here and it's still highlighted. You can change it to something more useful. You can call it as Python samples. Any useful name will do, right? So anything that you can conveniently look up. And once you've done this, you can press enter and it shows the folder name is Python samples. Select this folder And now you're inside the folder. The first time when you select some folders, you might actually get this dialog that you see in VS Code. It says, do you trust the authors of the files in this folder? Assuming it's all my files in my folder, I would just select trust the authors of all files in the parent folder, Chand. I think that's my home directory, by the way. Windows shortens my name to just 5 characters. Anyways, so, and I click on yes, I trust the authors. If you're trying to navigate some folders and you don't want to accidentally run some script that you don't trust, you can select no, I don't trust the authors. This is for folders that you don't own. Maybe some folders that might have some malicious scripts. Yeah, you can just select this. Such case, you can only browse the files there, but you cannot run them. Okay. So when you click on yes, I trust the authors, this gives me full access for me to execute programs from this folder where I save it. Right now, this Explorer interface that shows up in this corner, it shows everything is empty. So you can create a new file by clicking on new file here. Either you can click on this icon in the welcome tab, or you can also select file and say new file here. Either you can say new text file or new file, both will work. But when you select new file, it will prompt you some action here. Text file, Python file, Jupyter notebook. This Python file and Jupyter notebook came up because I installed Python extension and Jupyter notebook extension previously. So if I select Python file here, it shows up the Python, it shows up an untitled in this place, right? I chose untitled -1, and you can type in some Python code for testing. So maybe if you want to just test a simple code here, I can just say print off. Print is a function call. Don't worry about these for now. In the next session, I will tell you what these functions and statements and expressions do. So right now we can just blindly type and then type maybe hello world in double quotes. This is the obligatory test program that everybody starts off with when they're trying to journey into a new language. It's being popular from the C programming language by Brian Kenigan and Dennis Ritchie. It's the first program in the book, happens to be a C program that sort of prints hello world, right? Anyways, so you can just type this print, open parenthesis. I'm using the word parenthesis to represent rounded brackets, the brackets that are curved, right? So open parenthesis, open double quotes. You can also use single quotes, but I prefer using double quotes for strings, which I'll discuss later. And you can just type hello comma world. Anything, any string will do here. Close the quotes, close parenthesis, and then you're ready to go. Right now it shows you can see when I over the mouse, it becomes an X, but you can see on top it shows a dot, right? It shows a white dot on top that shows that the file is not saved. You want to save this file. To save it, you can select file and select save button. You can also use save as, but I'll say save for now. So if the file name is titled as untitled, you can see print hello world untitled on top. So when you select save here, is asking you where to save it. By default, the folder that you selected, Python samples, will be shown here. It's sort of shortened, right? But then it shows the file name is untitled1. I recommend you to save it into something more meaningful so you can remember what this file has, right? So I'm going to call this hello. In a Windows kind of an environment, when you type in the file name, the select file as type is selected by default as Python. That should do good. It will save it under the file name hello.py. So all your Python programs are saved with a .py extension, right? So the extension is .py in here. You can just make a note of that. So it is saved under Python samples in my home folder under the name hello.py. In order to run this program, you need to first configure the interpreter for the first time. And you can see that on my VS Code, the right corner, the right bottom corner, you can see select interpreter. It's sort of highlighted here in yellow. Click on this and it'll ask you, it says invalid Python interpreter selected, please change it, blah, 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 no problem. You can just select Python interpreter again. Yeah, and you can see this. There's a small drop down that shows up virtual environment. So create a virtual environment, enter interpreter path, use Python from default interpreter setting. And then there's a last option that shows Anaconda 3 python.exe. Because we install Anaconda and I want to use the Python runtime from the Anaconda environment, I can choose this as the option. And when I do this, it's going to you can see a small status window that shows reactivating terminals. It's going to take some time. And once it's ready, you can actually run this program. In order to run this program, you can anyway try doing it right now. You can click on the Run menu and click on Start Debugging. Or you can also use the shortcut, that is the function key 5 or F5 key. And when I click on this, it'll ask you to select Python debugger here and Python file. And you can see that it's launching it in our terminal here. So the simple program that I wrote with a simple statement in here that is saved in a file called hello.py and got executed as hello, world. This is the most common workflow that developers use. They're writing large applications. But for simple programs, this might look a little slow and an overkill, especially when I'm using Windows here like this. So it takes some more time to launch the terminal and run your program. So what I would normally suggest you people do, whether you use Windows, Linux, or macOS, is you can always have VS Code or any favorite editor of your choice, a programmer's editor where you can type in your Python code, which you can save it under a file with .py extension. And then in order to run this, you can always have this particular terminal handy. In this terminal right now, I'm inside the Python prompt. I have to exit from this. In order to exit this Python prompt, I can say Control Z, enter. I launched Python earlier, right? So, and I minimized it. So right now I exited it and I'm in the Anaconda prompt here, the shell prompt or the Windows command prompt in this case. You want to navigate to the folder where you saved a file. So in my case, I think because I'm using Windows Terminal, I can write dir to see what's inside my directory. There are a lot of files and folders. There's one of these folders where I saved my file, which is called Python samples. It's shown up as dir directory and shows Python space samples. The command is dir to see the contents of a directory. Remember, this is a Windows command. Okay, so this works on the Windows command line. This has nothing to do with Python as such. So here I can say cd space Python, press a tab key and see if it completes. In Windows, it does that. It shows up as Python samples in quotes. There's a space in between. That's why it's quoted it. But press enter. And now you're inside this particular folder. You can say dir here. And you can see a file called hello.py is created, which I saved in my VS Code. So whichever folder you saved it, go to that folder by typing cd. Cd is to change directory. This is a Windows command on the Windows command line, right? So you can just go to that folder and you can now type Python space hello.py. If you just type Python, it launches the Python runtime. And the most common mistake that people do as newbies is to run a Python program. They go to the Python prompt and then type Python hello.py. It will not work. You can see that it throws an error. This is a very common newbie mistake. You should note that that command that I typed is a Windows command, not a Python syntax. It's not a Python expression or a statement. So here in the Python REPL, what you're supposed to type is Python statements or Python expressions. So if you accidentally have gone inside this REPL, but you want to run a program, exit from it. So to exit, just type Control Z, enter. And then at the Windows prompt, you can see the Windows prompt that is there, base C : users. When you see this kind of a prompt, this is not a Python prompt, this is a Windows prompt as such, the Windows command prompt. You can now type Python hello.py. This is how you can run your program on the command line. I found this more convenient because the terminal emulation in Visual Studio Code was not very perfect. It's got a lot better in the recent times, but in the early days, certain interactive programs where I use progress bars or user input and so on, they don't work as expected, right? So that's the reason why I would rarely use a terminal that's provided by VS Code. I always stick to using the terminal separately through this Windows terminal with Anaconda prompt running, right? It's the same workflow if you plan to use Linux or macOS, which I will show you next. Let me just switch the window. I will just hang on a minute. Let me move this window across the side. If you're using a Mac OS or Linux, the process is similar. You can launch your favorite terminal. So you can use your terminal application on Mac OS. You can go to your applications and search for terminal and launch it. You get a terminal emulator. If you're running on Linux too, you have a terminal emulator available. So I'm going to select a terminal here. I think I already have a terminal open. I'm going to bring it in this particular screen. Here it is. Because I installed Anaconda and I've configured the shell profile, my terminal prompt shows the base. So as a confirmation, you can type which Python to show that it's coming from Anaconda. And usually, if you want to try out small Python code snippets in a REPL interface, in a Python interpreter, you can, as usual, type Python and you can try typing in any statements or expressions in here. And you can see the outcome. To exit this Python REPL, you can type Control D. Control D to exit, right? You get back to the base prompt. So I'm going to avoid switching between Windows and Linux now, okay? So I'm going to stick to Linux because I'm a Linux user. I've used Windows just to show people how things are different or similar on Windows environment, but mostly from here on, it's all going to be the same. So instead of a shell prompt, whenever you see a base shell prompt for Linux or a Mac OS, the equivalent you will see as a base with C:/users, whatever prompt that you see there, right? That's the shell prompt or the Windows command prompt. In this case, it's a Linux shell prompt. So when you type Python, it goes to the Python runtime and you see a Python REPL. Once you're in the Python REPL, it's the same whether you work on Linux, Mac OS, or Windows. For large part, they work similar. Just that if you want to exit the REPL, this REPL, you need to type Control D if you're using Linux or Mac OS in a terminal and exit out. If at all you want to try out Python programs and you want to save it to a file, you can launch VSCode from your Linux environment. Either you can go to the Linux application bar and search for VSCode, or if you're already on a terminal, you can just type code right here and it launches VisualStudio Code. You have a very similar interface like you just saw on the Windows environment. So you have a welcome screen. I'm going to do the same thing even here. I'm going to select File and open new folder. Open folder first. It's always a good idea to open a folder. And I'm going to create a new folder at this moment. So I'm just going to create a folder by name Python samples even here. So because I'm using Ubuntu with GNOME desktop, the interface might look like this. So if you're using KDE or XFCE or any kind of desktops, just know how to create a new folder. And you can just select that. Here it's a new folder creation. Click on this, the folder name. I'm going to type here too as Python samples. Yeah, if you're using a Mac OS, you got a Mac OS Finder window on which you can pretty much do the same thing like I'm showing you here. So I don't have a Mac OS set up for me to demonstrate at this moment. So I hope you can figure it out. Just select the option to create a new folder, create it. This folder is empty. Click on open. And just like you saw on the Windows environment, you have the Python samples being listed in here and you have the welcome screen. You can actually go ahead and click new file right here. And you got the same drop down where you can say text file, Python file, Jupyter notebook. I'll select Python file at this moment. And you have a new tab that's opened up titled as untitled-1. So I'm going to type the same thing that I did on my Windows environment. I'm going to type print, open parenthesis. When I open parenthesis, a close parenthesis is automatically added. That VS Code does that automatically. It's called auto completion. I can open double quotes. The close double quotes is automatically added too. I can type hello world here. And as you can see that the file is not saved. It shows a dot there. There's a white dot that you see there. You need to save it. In order to save this, as usual, you can use file save, or the shortcut for that is Control S or Command S if you're using a Mac OS, right? If you open VS Code on a Mac OS environment. So you can check your shortcuts by also clicking on File, the File menu. The shortcuts could be shown here. You can see this. It's Control S on my Linux setup. Also on Windows, Control S is the shortcut to save a file. So you can select this too, or you can type the shortcut. The first time you need to select save, I think my window opens up elsewhere. Okay, just one moment. Yeah. On my Linux, there's a small bug. I think the dialog box go behind. Okay. Anyways, so you have this dialog box that comes up where you can say what file to save it as. The .py is automatically added at the end. So just change the name here to something more meaningful. Don't use special characters in your file name. I will tell you the reason why later on. So just use simple words, right? Don't use spaces or anything of that sort. So I'm just going to save it as hello.py here too. I'm going to select the save button and the file is saved as usual. And now to run this, you can click on the function key 5 or select run and start debugging. The first time you try to run it, it'll ask you to select debugger. I'm going to say it's a Python debugger. It's going to ask for debug configuration. I'll select Python file and it automatically runs it. As long as you have configured Anaconda and you launch VSCode, I think it works without any much of a problem. You don't have to worry about selecting the interpreter and all that in this environment as such. But if your interpreter is not detected, you'll still see you'll see a small tab coming up in below asking you to select interpreter. But I guess you also get the option somewhere on one of these windows. I'm trying to see where it is. Yes, it's here. You may also get an option to select it in here, right? If your interpreter is not selected. But anyways, so interpreter selected. You can, oh yeah, you can see it right here. Sorry, you can see it here. It shows /bin/Python. But if you want to select a different version of Python here, you can select the interpreter by clicking on this link that you see below. Click on this. And yeah, I have so many interpreters installed in my setup here. So I'm going to select what is available in Anaconda. So I'm going to select Python 3.1. I'm not sure how come it's directed that way, but never mind. So I'm going to select that as a default interpreter. So click on F5, executes it. Oh yeah, sometimes when you press F5 in the terminal, you get this dialog box. This F5 key is supposed to be typed on this particular window, not in the terminal window, right? So anyways, and you get the output as usual. Now, if you want to try this program out on the terminal, you can also try it on terminal. You can write your program in here and you can have your terminal open. In the terminal, you can actually type, go to the folder where you save the file. So in my case, I saved it in a folder called Python samples. I'm going to head into that folder. For that, I can type cd py tab autocomplete. You can see that space is \escape that happens on most of your Unix shells, right? So when you enter in that folder, and I can type pwd to find out what is my current working directory. It's print working directory. That's a shell command again. And now I can see what's there in here. They have the command is ls. If you're using Linux or Mac OS, you can type ls to see what's there inside, and you can type python hello.py here. You can have a terminal window open on one side and you can have your editor window open on the other, and you can make some changes in your program and you can test it on terminal by just typing this command out. So this workflow is most commonly used by developers. It doesn't matter what editor you use. You can use PyCharm, you could use VSCode, you could use Notepad++, gedit. There are so many editors available. So you can choose any editor to type in your program, but have a window here, a terminal window or a command prompt window where you can try the Python program out by typing Python and the file name. Just make sure that you know where the files are saved, which particular folder it is saved. You can change to that folder and you can run it from there, right? So this is how you can get started with the Python environment. Now, I told you the basic workflow of creating a file, a .py file and running it. These are actual Python code files, also called as source code, right? Or Python programs. There's also another workflow that people use, especially if they are doing a lot of exploratory kind of analytics. So if you're, let's say, doing things like web scraping or trying out new stuff, trying out new libraries or new frameworks, or if you're doing data analytics or even trying to write small code snippets for, language learning models or machine learning kind of activities, trying to store them in .py files might not be very intuitive. So most of the times the files that you will have just about 3 or 4 lines worth code. So you have another way to do it, and that is using Jupyter. But before I talk about Jupyter, I should talk about one more variant of Python runtime. So this Python, when you type here, you get the default REPL. This is a standard REPL that comes shipped with your official Python, right? So when you type Python, there's a language runtime. If you don't pass an argument, if you don't pass any file name, it launches a REPL where you can try out Python statements and expressions. But this REPL is not very intuitive. It's meant for very basic use cases. If you're looking for a more powerful variant of this REPL, Anaconda bundles another variant of it called IPython. IPython can also be installed manually. It's a separate project which you can install using some Python package installers or your distro vendor's package manager. But if you have installed Anaconda, I can exit this REPL. I exited the REPL. I'm back at the shell prompt. I can type IPython instead of Python. You can try IPython here. And you can see that it launches up with this kind of a interface. It shows the same Python REPL information. It shows Python, what version of Python you're using, and it shows all the copyright and all the details. And you can see the prompt shows up as in, and that's a cell number, right? The same works even on Windows. Let me just show it on Windows also. It's exactly the same. Just one moment. Even if you're using Windows, let me just reduce the screen. Okay. If you're using Windows, you can launch your Anaconda prompt. I'm just going to minimize everything. Just launch Anaconda prompt. And within within the Anaconda prompt, there's a Windows command prompt that you see here. You can type IPython instead of Python. And this will launch this IPython interface. Now, IPython is an enhanced REPL than your default Python REPL. I use the word REPL here. REPL stands for read, evaluate, print loop. It's a loop that's constantly going to read input from you, evaluate those statements or expressions, and print the outcome of it. That's what it does, right? And it's good for exploring interesting features in Python. Now, in this REPL, you can try out all the things. You can try, like, say, 4 plus 5, just like you did in the Python prompt. But you can see that it shows in cell 1, the input was 4 plus 5. The output for cell 1 is 9. And now it shows in cell 2. You can say maybe, 67 plus 98. You got the output. We have a basic calculator here through this REPL. This REPL provides a lot of interesting features, which I will slowly explore as I go along, right? So if you see this kind of interface when I show up on my terminal, you know how I launched it. I typed IPython instead of Python, okay? And if you type IPython and you get some error like command not found or so on, the very likelihood is that you're not using Anaconda environment. So if you're using Anaconda, this will be pre-bundled. But if you decided not to use Anaconda and if you want IPython, you can also install it separately. Just find out how to install it. They got their own website. I will show you about that, okay, in a while. So this is one of the interface. So it's the same on Windows or macOS or Linux. So I'll just switch back to my Linux environment now. Let me move this Windows side. So you can see it's almost the same, right? Whether you use Windows or Linux or macOS, you type IPython at the Anaconda prompt and you get this interface. And here you can try all these basic expressions. You can exit this IPython environment by typing Control-D. This works both for Windows, Linux, or macOS. Unlike the Python prompt, you say Control-Z or Control-Z on Windows, but Control-D on Linux and macOS. But here, you can type Control-D on all 3 platforms. It'll ask you this interactive question, do you really want to exit? I can type Y to say yes and press enter. Now this works on a command line. Now there is a project called Jupyter, and Jupyter provides a GUI wrapper on top of this REPL and provides a lot of intuitiveness, and is more commonly used today. You can save all the code snippets that you write, small code snippets into one single file. We call that as a Jupyter notebook. Initially, this project was called as IPython notebook, but then later on, they made that particular project more independent from the language. Today, the Jupyter notebook is a separate project now, which can host support for not just Python, but for many other programming languages that have a REPL. So it works for Julia, it works for Rust, it works for many languages, right? There are way many languages now. And these language backends are also called as kernels, right? We call them as a language kernel. So the Jupyter Notebook is like a wrapper on top of a REPL of a particular programming language, which is called as a kernel, right? I'm going to show you how to launch Jupyter through VS Code. It's very convenient, but I'll also show you how to do it on the command line. Okay, first I'll show you how to do it on the command line, then I will show it on the VS Code. Okay, you'll understand it. So if you're the Anaconda prompt or your Windows command prompt where you launched Anaconda prompt, right? Here, and just clear the screen. I can just type Jupyter. Remember, the spelling is with a PY, not a PI. Okay, it is PY for Python. So Jupyter hyphen notebook. And this will use your default web browser. You'll see a lot of things coming up on a terminal, but after that, you'll see a default web browser coming up. It came up on another screen on my setup. I have multiple screens here. So you can see this. You get this interface. This is a Jupyter Notebook interface. Now, in this interface, you can select New and select Python 3. Because I have multiple languages and maybe multiple instances of Python, you see more options here. But in your case, you might just see Python 3 or just Python. Just select that. This works exactly the same even on Windows. Try this out on your Anaconda prompt, not in your Python prompt. Except from your Python prompt, in your Anaconda prompt, that is your base C: prompt, just type Jupyter-notebook and you'll see a default browser window popping up where you get this kind of home page. In the home page, you might want to select New and say, Python as such. Once you see this, you will see a new tab that shows up with Untitled here. And this is the GUI layer, a web-based interface layer on top of a backend REPL. The kernel that is selected is here. You can see this Python 3 kernel. That's the IPython running in the backend. So here at this cell, you can try out Python expressions like I did before, like I try 1 + 2. But when I press enter, it's not going to execute the expression because in a single cell in Jupyter, you can put multiple statements and expressions in a single cell. And that's a convenient feature. In order to execute this cell, you need to use a keyboard shortcut, Control Enter. If you're using macOS, you might want to try Command Enter, the command key followed by Enter. Your macOS keyboard has a command key, right? So, but on Windows and Linux, you can try Control Enter. Hold the Control key and press Enter. Or you can also click on the Run button if you see here. You can see a Run button here. It's also a Run. When you click on the Run button, it executes the current cell and it creates a new cell below automatically, right? So I think if you use Alt Enter or Option Enter on Mac, you'll get the same option. You get a similar option. Knowing the keyboard shortcuts in Jupyter Notebook goes a long way in saving you time. But of course, you cannot memorize all the keyboard shortcuts in one go. I would recommend start with the basics. How do you run a cell? How do you create a new cell below? How do you create a new cell above? How do you split a cell? So basic stuff. To know the keyboard shortcuts, you can go to Help and there's a keyboard shortcuts link right here. It shows all the keyboard shortcuts. The shortcuts might vary based on what platform you're using. Your shortcuts for macOS will be a little different. Shortcuts for Windows and Linux could be slightly different. Mainly the modifier keys might vary. You might see a shuffle between the command versus control key, right, amongst macOS versus Linux and Windows. So you can see all these shortcuts. Of course, the expectation is not to memorize it all in one day. It's difficult. Sometimes people want to take a screenshot of it and take a printout of it and keep it on the side. Stick it out on your cubicle or the place at your desk, and you can always watch out for shortcut keys when you want to access them. Anyways, so here you can try out small code snippets. You can go to another cell. If you want to create a new cell, you can always do this. I'll also show you one interesting thing about this Jupyter Notebook interface is they have two modes called command mode and edit mode. When you see this particular border highlight in blue, the border highlight in this side is blue. It's in a mode called command mode. When you press, you can, and in the command mode, you can use the arrow keys to select cells. If you have multiple cells, you can select them like this. But if you have a single cell, don't worry. Okay. In the command mode, the keyboard shortcuts work differently. But when you want to switch to edit mode, you press enter on a cell. You can see it's now highlighted in green. You can see the border is now turned green. So when the border is turned green, now it's in a mode called edit mode. And whatever you type now goes inside the cell. So this is sort of reminiscent of the VI editor or Vim editor if you've been using the command mode, edit mode, insert mode, right? Sort of similar to that. Some of the shortcuts are also quite similar to the Vim key bindings. If you have been using Vim editor or VI editor on Unix's environments, right? Sort of inspired from there. You can always press escape. Press the escape key to switch back to command mode. See this? It's now in the command mode. If you want to create a new cell below the current cell, switch to the command mode by pressing escape. Then you can use a shortcut B for below. If you want to create a cell above the current cell, you say A for above. So if I say A now, you can see a cell is created above the current cell. But I'm going to use the arrow key and select the cell this time. I want to create another cell below the current cell. I can press B. I can see this is how you can do the basic things, right? Select creating cells. And you can select a cell using arrow keys as usual. So I'll go to the first cell here, press enter. Now it's in edit mode. I can put a print, open parenthesis, open quotes, hello, comma world. And I can press enter. It goes in that cell itself. Next line. I can put one more print and say testing Jupyter notebook. In order to execute the cell, I can use Control Enter as a shortcut. Control Enter or Command Enter if you're using a macOS. Okay, use Control Enter if you're using Linux or Windows environment. So I say Control Enter. You can see the cell's output is shown right here. You can see some subtle difference. For the print, it just shows the output. But when I say 1 plus 2 here, let me just delete this garbage which I typed. Yeah, I put 1 plus 2 here. It shows out 2 and shows the value. There's a subtle difference here. This is an expression. Whenever you type in any expression in a REPL, the expression's output is shown here. There's an output of an expression. Print is treated more like a statement, not as an expression. The statement does certain thing, but it doesn't return anything to the code. As a program, I can't get the return value of print and do something with it, which I'll talk about in the next session about statements and expressions in more depth. But one more thing I should also tell you is that I put 1 plus 2 here. The next line I put, let's say 4 plus 5. And I press Control Enter. It shows only one output. It shows 4 plus 5 is 9. What about 1 plus 2? It doesn't show you the output for that. You might wonder what's going on. Well, when you have multiple expressions in a single cell in Jupyter, when you put multiple expressions, all the expressions are evaluated, but only the last expression's output is what will show up in out. It's like I ask you rapidly questions like, what is 1 plus 2? And before you could answer, if I ask, what is 4 plus 5? You will answer the last one, right? So that's how it is. So it's like, I asked 1 plus 2, then I said 4 plus 5. 4 plus 5's answer is what is printed. 1 plus 2's answer, it's lost. If you want to also print 1 plus 2, that's where you can explicitly use the print statement. You can use print of 1 plus 2 like this. And then I can leave it as 4 plus 5 here. Try it out. This is the outcome of print. Printed the output 3. You don't see the out label for that. You only see the out label for the last one, which is 4 plus 5. Now try this out. Try print 4 plus 5 like this. You see the difference? Can you notice the difference? You can see that out has vanished. That means the print is printing outcome of expression on its own. It does not return any value. So therefore, you don't see anything from the out label in here. Now, at this moment, I should digress a bit to tell you about learning programming, right? So because I'm teaching you programming from the very basics, there are some things you should know about learning how to code. Most common mistake that people do is they watch others explain how program works and they think they learned it. Yes. Yeah, you have listened to me so far and you're, oh yeah, print hello world, print testing, Jupyter notebook, print 1 plus 2, I know what it does. But until you try it out on your own, you can't be very sure. You can't be very confident that you really learned programming. So the best way to learn programming is not by simply watching videos, reading tutorials. You will get a glimpse of what the program looks like. You will understand what it does, but you will not be able to write one on your own. Learning programming is like learning spoken languages. Learning a new programming language is like learning a new spoken language. I might be good at my native language. It's my native tongue. I'm from south of India. Tamil is my native tongue. In my childhood, I also learned Kannada. So, because I was born and brought up in Bangalore. So I sort of think in those languages. It's automatic. What I think, my tongue can flutter and speak out. Right? We don't even have to think too hard. Right now I speak English, but in a way I've spoken English so much that I sort of think in English using the Indian vocabulary. That is a very minimalistic vocabulary of English that I use. Now the point is, assuming that I want to learn a spoken language. Let's say I want to learn Spanish. How do I start? To start with Spanish literature? No, bad idea. You want to learn a new language? You start with the very basics. You start with greetings, right? You start how to greet. I don't know how to greet in Spanish, but I can say, let's say if I want to speak in Kannada, which is a language in south of India, I could say namaskara to say hello. I think it's almost similar in most languages. In Hindi, it is namaskar, right? You say namaskara in Kannada. And you say, to say, how are you? You say, hegidira. So you'll start with very basic words to start greeting. And you cannot just watch others speak and learn. You might figure out what they are saying, but until you speak it out, you're not training your muscles, your tongue muscles in this case. Same way, when you're learning programming in a new language, you start by typing basic code, very simple code, simple statements. When you do that, this might look a little redundant and you may think, oh, I know algorithms and data structures in C++, in Java, but why I have to type all these things in Python? I can figure it out. No. If I ask you to write code from scratch from Python, you will stumble. You'll stutter. Your fingers won't move. But the moment you start practicing step by step, take your time out, start slow, practice these things, right? And slowly, subconsciously, you're actually doing training for your muscles, your muscle training. Eventually, you'll start thinking in Python. That's what you mean by telling fluent programming. If I say I'm fluent in Python, I should be able to think of the logic and my finger should move with Python syntax. If I say I'm fluent in C, I just think of the logic and I should be able to write in C syntax. Like whatever I think, I can speak out in a language like English. I can sort of fluently speak English because I've trained myself speaking in English. Right? I learned this the hard way from my personal experience with Hindi. I have learned Hindi in my school. I studied in Bangalore and Hindi was one of the subjects in my school days. I learned Hindi. I sort of know how to read Hindi, how to write Hindi. I could listen to conversation in Hindi and figure out what the person is speaking. But I never had an opportunity to really speak Hindi because I didn't have any Hindi friends in my school days for a long time. Today, I think there's a lot of people who are from North in South. Today, it's a different story. But during my time in the 90s, I didn't have a lot of friends who speak Hindi. So I couldn't really speak Hindi as much. But I didn't know that. I thought I was fluent in Hindi because I could watch even Bollywood movies and appreciate all the dialogues during that time. It's only when I went to Delhi where I had to really speak to Hindi to a cab driver and I couldn't really speak out. Then I realized, oh, I've been listening to Hindi, but I never spoke. That's exactly the same dilemma that many programmers have today. There's a lot of languages. There's a huge explosion of new age languages now. Like we have Rust as a new language, which is becoming very popular, especially for systems programming, kernel development, and all that, and various other use cases. Golang, there is Dart, there's Nim, there is Zig, there is Elixir. There are so many languages. When you suddenly learn one language and you look at another language, you'll see a lot of similarities, similar expressions, similar syntax. There are some patterns that you'll identify, but there'll be some subtle nuances which are different in that language. Subtle nuances. You'll start appreciating that when you learn Python to some extent, and then you look for a new language like Rust. You will see some similarities, but you'll see a lot of differences. So you'll see when in upcoming sessions, when I talk about statements and expressions, there are certain differences in those languages, or even JavaScript for that matter. You will start knowing those nuances only when you start typing in code step by step. Don't start with big projects. Start with something small to make sure that you become fluent in the language. So you understand the syntax grammar and your finger should flow with the syntax grammar without much of trouble, right? And then you take it to the next step where you actually start learning complex algorithms, trying to solve puzzles and so on. So that's something that I should tell you. Yeah, sorry for the digression, but this is important because I had to tell you exactly what it takes to become a good programmer, a fluent programmer. A lot of practice. You learn programming not by watching or reading programs or watching a tutorial, but by trying it out on your own a lot of times, right? The tutorials are like guidelines. When I'm telling you this is a step I take, I'm giving you the shortcut. So when you can also do self-learning. I have learned Python completely by self-learning. I mean, when I dabbled with Python in 97, the Python was not a popular language, at least in the industry. It was used by enthusiasts. And how do I learn it? By looking at Python documentation, the hard way. Try it out all permutation combination. So what I'm covering here is more of a refinement. So when I'm guiding you at this moment, I'm showing you the path that I walked through. So you know this path works and you'll take that path. That's the whole point. So more like a GPS, I would say, right? So I'm just giving you the guidance to take the direction. But you can always go to the path and then you can take a detour and say, what happens if I do this? You might learn something new. You might learn from mistakes, or you can learn from errors, and never shy away from making mistakes or errors in your learning. So most people say the first program I type must work. Don't worry about that. Try it out. When there is an error, read the error and try to figure out what the computer is trying to tell you, or what the language runtime is trying to tell you. And this way, you will be better equipped to deal with troubleshooting in the long run. The more errors you learn from, the more better you get at troubleshooting. And at some point when you have a fluency, when somebody's typing code, you'll say, this code will generate this error. You'll figure it out. And that's the level that you should aim at. And some of you might ask, how much time does it take? Oh, most people put a deadline in learning. My opinion, I might be a little biased in here, or maybe I would say a little radical in this case. You never learn with deadlines. Never. I have never learned with a deadline. So if at all I say, I need to finish this topic by today, and that doesn't happen, it leads to a little bit of frustration and demotivation. Some of you might like working with deadlines, but I'm not that person. And I recommend people not to work with deadlines in your learning. You should have, I would say there's a target, but you spend one day trying out all different things to make some code work. Maybe the code didn't work, but you might think that the code did not work, but the time you spend there, you would have learned a lot of pitfalls, a lot of mistakes you made. And that's what the learning for you is. You think you're not progressing, but every failure that you encounter is a stepping stone for you in the long run. So it's like, I also use this example where I say, if at all somebody says there's no progress for like 1 week, I'm learning, but there's nothing much is happening. You're looking at the final outcome, but you didn't know about all the roots and branches that you took in figuring out all the probabilities where you made mistakes, and you know your thought process getting refining there. It's like a tree that's growing. Most trees, not all, but most of them I see, when they shoot up, the initial few months or even few years, you don't see much of growth. You don't see any growth on top. But you know what's happening? The roots are being built. It's making the roots stronger. You don't know that. It's only at some point you'll see that once the roots are firm and well established, then you'll see the tree just grows like, maybe about 1 year, for first 2 years, the tree would have just about 2 or 3 leaves sprouting out, but maybe after a year or two, it just grows with not much of an effort. That's exactly how the learning is. The initial times, how much of time you spend on the foundation or the fundamentals goes a long run in making sure your foundations are strong, so that when you start learning advanced concepts, you'll be able to connect the dots more clearly, right? So keep that in mind. So sorry for the digression, but I just thought this is good to share. It's my experience. I'll be sharing a lot of these kind of digressing thoughts in this tutorial session. If you don't like it, just let me know. Okay, so I will cut it out on the future future tutorial sessions. But I thought this could be useful to many people who might be interested. Anyways, coming back here, I told you about the print function. I told you how you can use print to see the outcome of the print output right here. This is one of the interface, right? This is the Jupyter interface. Jupyter gives you lots and lots of features. Covering all the features in Jupyter in one go, I think it'll not be a good idea, because too much being covered in a short tenure means that you'll forget more, right? So I just showed you the very basics of getting started with Jupyter right now, and showed you how to create cells, how to write basic code in it, how to run it. This is the bare essentials. And last thing I should tell you is this file is saved, right? It's not saved as a .py file, by the way. All the code snippets are put in one single notebook. You call this a notebook, okay? So there's one code, there's another code, there's another code. You can have different code snippets put together in a notebook, each of them trying out different things. Rather than having a separate files, you can have them in one single notebook with multiple code snippets in here. And this, you can save it by clicking on this tab that is. So you see this untitled here? Click on this. It's going to come up with the dialog box. And here you can save it as, session. I'm going to call it session 2. Just call it session 2. That's enough. It'll add a .ipynb extension at the end. So it's just going to save it. You set a session 2. Where is it saved? It is saved in the default path where you launched Jupyter Notebook. From whichever folder you launched Jupyter Notebook, it will be saved there. So I think I launched it from my Python samples folder. I will show it to you right there in a while. You can also go back in here in the home screen. You can see this session02.ipynb. You can always open it anytime you want. It's already running. You can close the session by closing it. You can also shut down this session altogether by clicking on this selected session. Select this option. You can click on shutdown, the session shutdown. You can also close this browser window, and you're here in this place where you launch Jupyter Notebook, right? You can say Control-C here and exit. Control-C will cancel out the Jupyter Notebook instance. Will shut down. Now, whichever folder you launch Jupyter Notebook from, that folder, I'm running ls because I'm using Linux. If you're using Windows, type dir instead of ls, right? So you can see this file is saved as a .ipynb file. For people who are fairly advanced users, that's not a Python code. It's actually a JSON file, okay? If I show you the file content here, it's got some JSON format, we call them. Don't worry about this. If you're new, don't worry about this, okay? It's a particular file format which can only be understood by Jupyter. You cannot run this with Python. This file is not a Python program. So you cannot run this using your Python runtime directly. You can only launch it through Jupyter. You can open it through Jupyter and execute all the code snippets that you typed. This this particular session that I saved, you might wonder why it is called .ipynb. It stands for IPython Notebook. Jupyter initially was called as IPython Notebook, but now they changed the project name to make it more language agnostic. It's not Python specific anymore. Okay, that's the reason. It's called Jupyter, but the old extension style is still retained. Now, you can also launch Jupyter inside the Visual Studio Code. Inside VS Code, All you need to do is just select File and New File here. And you can see a lot of options come up. You have a Jupyter Notebook support here. Click on this. It opens up a new .ipynb file right here. You can see this. This is one way to open it. I'm going to close this, okay? I'm not going to save it. You can select File, New File, and in that drop down, you can select Jupyter Notebook. To create a new notebook, that's how we do it. You can also launch Jupyter Notebook by another way. If you're using VSCode, there's one magic keyboard shortcut you should always remember. There's so many options in this Visual Studio Code. Remembering keyboard shortcut for everything is difficult. So know one of these master shortcut, I will say, the main shortcut, and that is Control-Shift-P. Control-Shift-P. I think if you're using macOS, it will be Command-Shift-P. Check it out. Okay, maybe Command-Shift-P. So it's a Control-Shift-P, you get a palette like this, called as command palette. So in this command palette, you can actually type in anything you want. For example, I can type Jupyter, Jupy. So it says create new Jupyter notebook right there. You can select it. And now we have Jupyter notebook open. So if you want to launch a lot of features, you don't remember the keyboard shortcut, or it's difficult to go and navigate through menus, but you're looking for that through search, right? You want to search for some features. You can say Control-Shift-P anytime. You can search for it. You can say maybe Python. You can see a lot of options for Python. Python create terminal, create environment. There's so many options in here, right? Depending on what all extensions you have installed on VSCode. All right. So you can open and you can create a new notebook in Jupyter, in VS Code, also by using this file, or Control-Shift-P, create new Jupyter notebook. I'm going to close this again, not save it. You can also open an existing notebook which I created earlier in the browser interface in here. How do I do that? You can use the file explorer. You can see a file explorer in here. Select that. And as long as you are in the same folder where you save these notebook, save the notebook, you can select that folder. You can see this session2.ipynb. It shows a notebook like icon here. Select it, and it opens it up. It shows the code and the outcome. Same shortcuts which I showed you in Jupyter Notebook. A lot of them, similar shortcuts work even in here, right? I should also tell you that the Jupyter Notebook I showed you earlier, the browser-based interface, is the official project, Jupyter project, and it's quite mature. It's been there for more than a decade. But this extension that you see inside VS Code is a quite recent project. It's got a lot better in the recent times. I remember back in the days, I think in 2019, when I encountered it first, it had a lot of rough edges, I would say. Some things don't work as expected. Some shortcuts don't work. But now I think they've fixed a lot of things. I don't see much of a problem. You can go to this particular entry like this. Select the cell. See, it's right now, it's highlighted like this. It's right now in edit mode. Cursor's blinking inside. You can click on run by clicking on the run button right here. It'll ask you the first time, select Python environment. I'll select Jupyter kernel for this, okay? So to run this, I'll select Jupyter kernel, select default Python, what version of Python that is. It shows all these versions here. I don't see Anaconda listed. I'm surprised to see that. Okay, let me just try to refresh. I think I have multiple installations of Python, so it's got a little messy. Hang on, let me just run this again. Let me select the Python environment here. Yeah, you can select Python environment and select Anaconda, right? First time. Click on this. I hate these things. Just click on no. It executed it. You can see a tick mark here, how much time it took, and it shows the output. I can always create a new cell the same way. Right now I think it's in command mode. If I use the arrow keys, I can switch between all these cells. There are too many cells created. Like I don't want these two cells. If I want to delete a cell, both in Jupyter Notebook and in VS Code's interface for Jupyter that you see here, you can use X to cut. X is cut. You could also use another keyboard shortcut called DD, delete a cell, okay? DD comes from Vim editor, by the way. But you can use X. X will cut a cell. If you want to get a new cell above the current cell, you can use A as usual. While you're in command mode, use A, a new cell is created. Now, if you want to edit the cell, press enter. you can see the highlight is changed here. This shows it's in edit mode. When you see a border, blue border in here, it shows in edit mode. And here you can type in any statement. For example, I could write maybe 56. I can just say maybe 1 plus 2 into 3. This is an arithmetic expression. And what do you think is the result of this is? Well, we all learned in elementary schooling about, I think in India it's called as Bodmar's rule, bracket of division, multiplication, addition, and subtraction. I think sometimes it's called PEDMAS, I'm not sure. Okay, parenthesis of whatever, right? So anything. We have different kind of acronyms to note that. The point is, if you look at the outcome, it's first 2 into 3 done first. 2 3s are 6, and 6 plus 1 is 7, right? The outcome must be 7. To see the output, Control Enter, shortcut will work. You can see it shows 7 right here. If at all I want to change the scope, how do you do that? You can use parenthesis here to represent the scope. Try to run this cell again. Shows 9. Very basic things, right? So you can try out simple expressions in here. In the next session, I'll talk about expressions, statements, variables, data type. So I'll talk about these. You'll learn more about the coding in Python as such. So in this small, I don't think it's small, it's gone quite long. But anyways, in this session, you learned how to get started in your Python environment, be it creating a file, saving it as .py file and executing it in the command line. You also learned how to use IPython REPL, the very basics, but I also told you how to use Jupyter Notebook, both from the official Jupyter Notebook available through Anaconda, which will launch from the terminal, or you can also launch Jupyter from inside VS Code, assuming that you've installed the Jupyter extension in the extension manager. Right? In the extension manager, make sure you have installed Jupyter. Once you installed it, like it's installed in here, right? It's from Microsoft. So once you install Jupyter, you can launch Jupyter by, Control-Shift-P, type Jupyter, create new Jupyter notebook, or you already have a file with an extension .ipynb, which is an existing notebook. You can always open that notebook by clicking on it, and it's opened up right here. And whatever changes you make here, you can always save it as usual by using Control-S. It will be saved back in the notebook, right? The next session, I will go more formally into the ingredients of a Python program. So statements, expressions, and so on. So we'll learn about more into the concepts that make up a program, right? All the programming concepts. I will start from the third session. Hope you found this video useful. So if you find it useful, do as usual, like, share, subscribe, the YouTube stuff, right? So do that. And if you have any questions or queries, feel free to post them on comments, or you can also reach out to me. I think my contact is in the description, so you can always contact me personally if you want to. But if you want to post it for others' benefit too, you can post it on comments, right? Thank you very much. So hope to meet you in the next part session. Thank you.